The smallest bobcat ever seen was too small to survive. What the vet did next shocked everyone. The old rotary phone's shrill ring cut through the midnight silence like a blade, its brass bell echoing off the weathered wooden walls of Silas Boone's cabin. At 73, his hearing wasn't what it once was, but that particular sound urgent, demanding had trained his ears. Over decades of emergency calls, he didn't need to fumble for his wire-rimmed glasses or squint at the yellowed clock face on his nightstand. At 1 a.m., there was only one reason anyone would call: Silas's weathered hand, marked by countless scratches from frightened claws and grateful licks from rescued creatures. Reach for the heavy black receiver. His joints protested arthritis was an unwelcome companion in his golden years, but he lifted it with the same steady determination that had guided him through 47 years of veterinary practice. "There's a dying cub." Tessa's voice came through the crackling line, each word heavy with urgency and exhaustion. As the head technician at the Wild Hearts Rescue Center, she'd seen her share of hopeless cases. But something in her tone told Silas this was different. The mother bobcat lost a leg in an accident but just gave birth to 4 kittens. 3 are healthy, nursing well, responding to her care. The 4th, Silas. It's too small, too weak. She's pushing it away from the others. And we both know what that means in the wild. The pause that followed stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken understanding. In nature, mothers made brutal calculations. Energy spent on the weakest often meant death for the stronger. It was harsh mathematics written in survival instincts older than civilization. If anyone can save it, it's you. Tessa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas said nothing in response, but his silence spoke volumes. He'd never been one for grand speeches or false promises. Instead, he moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd spent decades answering calls in the darkest hours. The receiver found its cradle with a soft click, and within moments, he was pulling his worn flannel shirt over shoulders that had carried the weight of countless small lives. His old boots cracked leather that had walked through muddy fields, sterile clinic floors, and forest paths wheezed as he slipped his feet into them. The sound was familiar, comforting even, like the breathing of an old friend. His thick wool coat, heavy with the scent of pine and years of midnight rescues, settled around his shoulders as he stepped into the November night. The drive to the rescue center took him down winding country roads he could navigate, blindfolded. Bare trees stretched skeletal fingers against a star-scattered sky, and their branches creating intricate shadows in his headlights. The radio played soft jazz, Miles Davis, painting melancholy notes that seemed to echo his thoughts. How many drives like this had he made? How many small, desperate creatures had he cradled in his hands, feeling their hearts flutter like captured birds? The Wild Hearts Rescue Center sat nestled in a grove of ancient oaks, its converted barn structure warm with yellow light spilling from windows. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, a modern touch. Grant, the director, had insisted upon despite Silas's grumbling about newfangled contraptions. The facility had grown over the years, from a simple wildlife rehabilitation station to a respected center that drew volunteers and funding from 3 counties. Tessa met him at the door, her usually neat brown hair escaping from its ponytail, her scrubs wrinkled from hours of tending to their newest arrivals. At 35, she possessed the rare combination of scientific knowledge and intuitive understanding that made her invaluable to the center's mission. Her eyes, usually bright with optimism, carried shadows tonight. "She's in recovery room 3, Tessa said, leading him through corridors lined with cages containing the center's current residents, a great horned owl with a healing wing, a family of raccoons preparing for release, a red fox recovering from a vehicle strike. The familiar sounds and smells of the center surrounded them, the soft rustle of hay, the quiet chirping of nocturnal birds, the gentle hum of heating systems maintaining optimal temperatures for healing. The recovery room glowed with soft red light, designed to minimize stress on the animals while allowing staff to monitor their charges. Shadow, the mother bobcat, lay on her side in a specially constructed enclosure. Her breathing labored but steady. The recent amputation site where her left hind leg had been removed was healing well. Wrapped in clean bandages, that Tessa changed twice daily. Despite her injury, her maternal instincts remained strong. 3 healthy cubs, each about the size of Silas's fist, nursed contentedly against her belly, their tiny paws kneading rhythmically as they fed. But it was the 4th cub that drew Silas's attention. A creature so small it seemed more shadow than substance. It lay at the edge of the nest, separated from its siblings by what might as well have been an ocean. Its breathing was barely perceptible, shallow gasps that seemed to require tremendous effort. The tiny body, covered in sparse gray fur, trembled with each exhale. "The mother's been pushing it away for 6 hours now," Tessa explained, her voice clinical but unable to hide the emotion beneath. "Every time I place it with the others, she moves it back to the edge. Her milk production is good, but she's made her choice." Silas knelt beside the enclosure, his knees protesting against the concrete floor. At his age, every movement required consideration. But he'd long ago learned to ignore the complaints of an aging body when duty called. He studied the rejected cub with eyes that had evaluated thousands of animals over the decades, eyes that had learned to see beyond the obvious. With thousands, re-hell, please, in the please, given comments, to spot the spark of will that sometimes existed even in the most hopeless cases. When Tessa gently lifted the tiny creature and placed it in his cup palms, Silas felt its body heat, or rather, the alarming lack of it. The cub was cold, hypothermic, its life force flickering like a candle in a storm. Its weight was negligible, perhaps 4 ounces, when it should have been twice that. Through the thin skin, he could feel the rapid flutter of a heart working overtime to pump life through a body that seemed determined to surrender. "No one believes it will survive," Tessa said quietly, watching his face for any sign of his decision. She'd worked with Silas long enough to read his expressions, to understand the careful way he evaluated each case. "Grant thinks we're being cruel, prolonging suffering instead of preventing it." Silas stared at the cub for a long moment, feeling the weight of decision. In his decades of practice, he'd learned that sometimes mercy meant letting go, allowing nature to take its course without human interference. But he'd also learned to recognize something indefinable, a quality that transcended medical statistics and survival odds. This tiny creature, rejected by its mother and dismissed by others, possessed something that made him pause. Finally, he nodded softly, the gesture barely perceptible in the red-tinted light. "I'm not bringing it home to save it," he said, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of a man who'd made countless difficult decisions. "It just needs to be given a chance." The drive back to his cabin passed in contemplative silence. The tiny cub nestled in a warming pouch against his chest. Through the thin fabric, he could feel each fragile heartbeat. Irregular but persistent, the radio played softly, Coltrane now, notes spiraling upward like prayers, while Silas's mind cataloged everything he'd need for the days ahead. His cabin, built by his own hands 30 years ago, sat on 12 acres of mixed forest and meadow. It was a simple structure, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that opened into a living area dominated by a stone fireplace, and a small office where he'd once maintained patient records. The walls were lined with bookshelves holding veterinary texts, field guides, and worn novels his late wife Margaret had loved. Photographs chronicled decades of rescued animals, some returned to the wild, others who'd found permanent homes, a few who'd touched his heart so deeply that their memory brought both joy and ache. Inside the warm cabin, Silas moved with practiced efficiency despite his exhaustion. From a storage closet filled with supplies accumulated over years of wildlife rescue, he retrieved a small cardboard box, the kind once used for shipping medical supplies to his old practice. He lined it carefully with an old wool scarf, soft gray wool that Margaret had knitted during the winter before her death 5 years ago. Her fingers had worked the yarn with the same gentle precision she'd brought to everything, and now that softness would cradle another vulnerable life. The makeshift nest found its place on the kitchen table, close enough to the propane heater to maintain warmth, but not so close as to create dangerous temperature fluctuations. Beside it, Silas arranged his supplies, a box of disposable syringes, cotton swabs, kitten milk replacer, a digital thermometer, and a notebook where he would record feeding times, weights, and observations. The first feeding attempt revealed the depth of the challenge ahead. The cub was too weak to nurse from even the smallest bottle nipple, its sucking reflex barely present. Instead, Silas filled a plastic syringe with diluted formula, warm but not hot, tested against his wrist, the way he'd once tested bottles for his own children, and administered it drop by precious drop. Each drop required patience that seemed infinite. The cub's mouth was smaller than his thumbnail, and swallowing was a monumental effort that left the tiny creature exhausted. After each drop, Silas gently wiped away excess formula with a cotton swab, careful not to let moisture accumulate around the nose and mouth where it might interfere with breathing. The process took nearly an hour for what amounted to less than a teaspoon of nourishment. When it was finished, Silas weighed the cub on a postal scale for 2 ounces, barely enough to register. He recorded the information in his notebook, then settled the exhausted creature back into its woolen nest. The alarm clock beside his bed was set for 1-hour intervals, a schedule that would govern his life for the foreseeable future. At 73, sleep had become precious deep. Uninterrupted rest was one of the few luxuries of age he'd been looking forward to. But now his nights would be punctuated by the demanding cry of the alarm, followed by the shuffle to the kitchen, the careful preparation of formula, and the delicate dance of keeping a dying creature alive. The first night was a marathon of exhaustion and determination. Each hourly feeding brought the same routine check temperature. Prepare formula. Administer drop by drop. Clean and weigh. Record observations. The cub's weight fluctuated ounce by ounce, sometimes gaining, sometimes losing, always teetering on the edge of survival. By dawn, Silas's back ached from hunching over the kitchen table. His eyes burned from the strain of working in lamplight, and his hands cramped from the precise motions required for feeding. But the cub was still breathing, still fighting, still clinging to life with a tenacity that commanded respect. The days that followed established a rhythm born of necessity and devotion. Every 2 hours during the day, every hour through the night, the feeding ritual continued. Silas measured his life in syringes of formula and grams of weight gained or lost. His world contracted to the space between the kitchen table and his bedroom, with brief excursions to the phone to update Tessa or to the pantry for his own sparse meals. Tessa visited daily, bringing fresh supplies and offering to take over night feedings, but Silas politely declined. Something about the cub's situation had awakened a protective instinct he thought had been buried with Margaret. This tiny creature had been rejected by its mother, dismissed by experts, and given up for dead, but it continued to fight. That fight deserved his full attention and his complete commitment. The transformation began gradually, so subtly that Silas almost missed it. On the 5th day, the cub's weight crossed 5 ounces for the first time. On the 7th day, its breathing became less labored. On the 10th day, it began to respond more actively during feeding, actually working to swallow rather than simply accepting the drops passively. But it was on the 14th day that everything changed. Silas was conducting his morning feeding routine, carefully administering formula with the mechanical precision that had become second nature, when he noticed something different. The cub's eyes, which had remained sealed shut since birth, were beginning to crack open tiny slits that revealed dark, unfocused pupils. For several minutes, Silas continued the feeding, trying to contain his excitement while maintaining the steady rhythm the cub had learned to expect. But when the last drop was administered and he gently cleaned the tiny mouth, those eyes opened fully and focused directly on his face. The gaze was profound in its intensity, not the unfocused stare of a newborn, but something deeper, more aware. It seemed to penetrate beyond his weathered features to something essential beneath. For a moment that stretched into eternity, man and wild creature regarded each other with mutual recognition. "I'm here," Silas whispered, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected. "This time, I won't let go." The words surprised him with their intensity, carrying weight that went beyond mere dedication to an injured animal. They were a promise that reached into parts of his heart that had remained sealed since Margaret's death, chambers where grief and guilt had festered in isolation. This tiny creature, fighting against impossible odds, had somehow found the keys to those locked places. As the days passed, the quiet cabin began to pulse with new life. The cub whom Silas had begun calling Maple, inspired by the reddish tints in her growing fur, started displaying personality quirks that both amused and amazed him. She had developed a preference for sleeping inside one of his old leather boots, curling up in the worn interior with complete contentment. "She must think I'm a tree and the boot is a hollow," Silas chuckled to himself, watching as Maple arranged herself with the precise movements of a creature following ancient instincts. Her growth accelerated now that her eyes were open and her feeding responses had strengthened. At 3 weeks old, she was attempting to walk, though her coordination remained charmingly clumsy. She would take 2 or 3 wobbling steps before tumbling over, lying on her back, with all 4 paws waving in the air until Silas gently righted her. To encourage her development, Silas created simple toys from household items. A wooden bead suspended from a shoelace became her primary nemesis, swaying just within reach as she crouched and pounced with increasing accuracy. Her attacks were fierce despite her size, and her victory celebrations, tiny chirps and enthusiastic rolling, never failed to bring laughter bubbling up from places in Silas's chest that had been silent for years. The sound of his own laughter surprised him. It had been so long since Joy had lived in his cabin that he'd forgotten how it changed the very atmosphere of the place. The walls, which had seemed to absorb and hold on to grief like a sponge, suddenly felt lighter, more alive. Even the familiar creak of floorboards seemed cheerful rather than mournful. Maple's favorite activity quickly became climbing onto Silas's belly when he reclined in his old leather armchair. She would scale the gentle slope like a mountaineer conquering Everest, then collapse dramatically on her back with all 4 paws extended skyward. Her purr, barely audible but unmistakably present, vibrated against his chest as he stroked her head with one gentle finger. "Guess someone dreams of being a panda," he would tease, marveling at how this tiny wild creature had adapted to domestic comfort while retaining her essential wildness. Tessa's visits became highlights of both their weeks. She would arrive with fresh supplies and updates from the rescue center. But increasingly, she came simply to witness the miracle unfolding in Silas's kitchen. Watching Maple attack her feeding bottle with growing enthusiasm, or seeing her stalk a dust mote with the focused intensity of an apex predator, never failed to bring tears to Tessa's eyes. "She's so small, but so fierce," Tessa observed one afternoon, watching as Maple attempted to intimidate a piece of string that had dared to move without her permission. The observation was more profound than either of them realized at the time. Maple was indeed fierce, not in the way of her wild cousins who relied on size and strength, but with an intensity of spirit that transcended physical limitations. She approached every challenge, from learning to walk to conquering the dreaded shoelace bead, with complete commitment and infectious enthusiasm. Grant's opposition to the rescue effort had been well known throughout the center. As director, he bore the responsibility for allocating limited resources and making difficult decisions about which animals to save and which to allow nature to claim. His philosophy, shaped by decades of wildlife management, leaned heavily toward practical considerations rather than emotional ones. But even Grant's skepticism couldn't withstand the evidence of his own eyes. When he made an unannounced visit to Silas's cabin 6 weeks after the rescue, expecting to find either a dead kitten or a hopelessly dependent creature, he instead discovered Maple in full exploration mode. She was investigating a cardboard box with the methodical thoroughness of a detective, climbing over it, under it, and through it while maintaining a running commentary of chirps and mews. The sight of her eyes bright, movements coordinated, coat glossy with health, stopped Grant in his tracks. He stood in the doorway for several minutes, watching as Maple noticed his presence and approached without fear, studying him with the same intense curiosity she applied to everything in her expanding world. "Maybe," Grant said finally, the admission carrying weight that went beyond simple acknowledgement of error. For a man who prided himself on professional judgment, admitting mistake required considerable courage. As Maple grew stronger and more active, her hunting instincts began to emerge with startling clarity. Silas's old felt hat became her primary nemesis, a formidable opponent that required stalking, pouncing, and vigorous wrestling to subdue. Her attacks grew more sophisticated with practice, incorporating actual hunting techniques that she seemed to understand instinctively, despite having no mother to teach them. Top predator strikes again. Silas would laugh as Maple sent the hapless hat flying across the room with a particularly enthusiastic pounce. But beneath the laughter lay growing awareness of an approaching reality that Silas tried not to contemplate too deeply. Maple was a wild bobcat, and despite the comfort and safety of domestic life, her future lay in the forest. Every day she grew stronger and more capable was a day closer to their inevitable separation. The rescue center's outdoor training facility had been constructed specifically for situations like Maple's predators, who required guidance in developing hunting skills they should have learned from their mothers. The enclosure was spacious, incorporating natural features like fallen logs, rock formations, and dense brush, where prey animals could hide and hunting skills could be practiced safely. Maple's introduction to the training facility marked a turning point in both their lives. At 3 months old, she had grown from a 4-ounce wisp of fur into a compact, powerful predator weighing nearly 3 pounds. Her coat had developed the distinctive markings of her species, subtle spots and bars that would help her blend with forest shadows. Her eyes, once unfocused and vulnerable, now held the keen intelligence of a creature designed for survival. The transition was traumatic for both of them. When Silas placed Maple in the training enclosure and walked away, her cries followed him like physical pain. Every instinct screamed at him to return, to gather her up and take her back to the safety of the cabin. But he forced himself to keep walking, fists clenched at his sides, heart breaking with each plaintive call from the observation blind. He and Tessa watched Maple's first attempts at independent living. Initially, she simply sat by the enclosure door, waiting for him to return. When hunger finally motivated her to explore, her movements were tentative, uncertain. The live mice introduced for hunting practice seemed to sense her inexperience. They moved boldly, almost contemptuously, around this small predator who had forgotten she was supposed to be dangerous. Maple's first hunting attempts were exercises in frustration. She would crouch and stalk with admirable form, then pounce with explosive energy, only to find empty space where her prey had been moments before. The mice, fat and lazy from captive breeding, should have been easy targets. But timing and coordination couldn't be learned from books or instinct alone. For 3 days, Maple caught nothing. She grew thinner despite the supplemental food Tessa provided, and her confidence visibly waned. Several times she simply lay down in the middle of a hunt, as if the effort required more than she could summon. But on the 4th morning, something fundamental shifted. Silas arrived at the observation blind to find Maple crouched motionless beside a fallen log, her body coiled with potential energy. For nearly 20 minutes, she held that position, displaying the infinite patience that separated successful predators from unsuccessful ones. When the mouse finally emerged from its hiding place, Maple's strike was lightning quick and absolutely precise. From behind the observation tent, Tessa burst into tears as they watched Maple carry her prize with obvious pride. She really did it. Tessa sobbed, her emotion a mixture of joy and heartbreak that Silas understood completely. He watched with eyes brimming with tears, equal parts pride and sorrow, celebration and grief. This moment represented both the culmination of their efforts and the beginning of the end of their relationship. Maple had crossed a threshold from dependent creature to independent predator, and there was no going back. Over the following weeks, Maple's hunting skills improved dramatically. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated prey location, to move with the silent grace that made bobcats such effective predators, to strike with the precision that meant the difference between feast and famine in the wild. Her confidence grew with each successful hunt, transforming her from a creature dependent on human care to a wild animal capable of surviving on her own. The date for her release was set for early autumn, when prey would be abundant and weather conditions favorable for a young predator establishing territory. As the day approached, Silas found himself treasuring each interaction with increasing intensity. He memorized the sound of her purr and the weight of her body when she climbed onto his lap, the way her eyes tracked movement with predatory focus. On their last night together, he made an exception to the carefully maintained boundaries between wild creature and caretaker. Instead of sleeping in her training enclosure, Maple was allowed to spend the night in his cabin, curled up tight against his chest in the bed they'd shared during her earliest weeks. She seemed to understand the significance of the moment, settling against him with unusual stillness. There was no playful batting at his fingers, no restless exploration of the bedroom, just the quiet presence of a creature saying goodbye in the only way she could. Tomorrow, you'll have a sky of your own, Silas whispered into the darkness, his words carrying all the love and hope and heartbreak of their months together. Before dawn, as pale light began filtering through the bedroom windows, Maple pressed her face into his chest, not meowing, not demanding attention, just present, still, as if offering silent gratitude for the chance at life she'd been given. The release site was a section of state forest known for its healthy bobcat population and abundant prey. Ancient oaks and maples created a canopy that filtered sunlight into dappled patterns, perfect for stalking. A small stream provided water, and the dense understory offered countless hiding places for both predator and prey. Silas carried the transport cage to a small clearing where Maple could orient herself without feeling immediately threatened by dense cover. His hands shook slightly as he worked the latch, not from age or cold, but from the weight of the moment. For months, his entire world had revolved around keeping this creature alive. Now he was deliberately setting her free, trusting that the lessons learned in captivity would serve her in the wild. When the cage door swung open, Maple didn't immediately rush out. She sat for several moments, processing the flood of scents and sounds that represented her natural world. The forest was alive with possibilities, prey animals rustling through fallen leaves, other predators marking territory, the complex web of relationships that would now include her. Finally, she stepped out onto the forest floor, her movements cautious but confident. She took several steps away from the cage, then turned to look back at Silas. The moment stretched between them, filled with everything that couldn't be expressed in words. Then she turned and melted into the forest with the silent grace of her kind, vanishing as if she'd never been anything more than a shadow. Silas stood in the empty clearing long after she disappeared, tears streaming down his weathered face, but a smile playing at his lips. The pain of separation was real and sharp, but underneath it lay a deeper satisfaction, the knowledge that he'd helped return something wild and beautiful to its proper place in the world. That night, back in the cabin that suddenly felt enormous and empty, he opened the notebook that had tracked Maple's progress from desperate kitten to independent predator. His final entry was brief but profound. Day 274, Maple is free. I am empty. But it is a joyful emptiness. He closed the journal and blew out the oil lamp, settling into darkness that no longer felt oppressive but peaceful, filled with the knowledge that somewhere in the forest, a small miracle was learning to make her way in the world. The months that followed brought their own rhythms. Silas returned to his quiet routines, tending his garden, reading by the fire, accepting the occasional emergency call from the rescue center. But something fundamental had changed. The cabin no longer felt like a museum of grief, but like a place where life had triumphed, where impossible odds had been overcome through patience and dedication. When the trail camera captured its precious image, Maple, now fully grown and magnificent, leading two tiny cubs along a forest path, Silas felt his legs give way. He sank into his chair, overwhelmed by emotions that spanned the entire spectrum of human experience. Maple hadn't just survived, she had thrived, found a mate, and continued the ancient cycle of life. The photograph showed her in her prime muscles rippled beneath her thick coat, eyes alert and confident. Every inch, the successful predator she'd been trained to become. But it was the cubs that brought tears streaming down his face, tiny replicas of their mother, learning to navigate their world under her patient guidance. She had become what he'd always hoped she could be, not just a survivor, but a continuation of something larger than herself. In those cubs, he saw the legacy of their shared months, proof that sometimes love and determination could overcome even the most impossible circumstances. The next fall brought an encounter that felt like a gift from the universe itself. While walking a familiar forest path during his weekly constitutional, Silas became aware of being watched. Years of working with wild animals had sharpened his senses to such presence. And he stopped, scanning the trees with careful attention. There, perhaps 50 yards away, a bobcat sat perfectly still, regarding him with calm intelligence. She was too distant for him to make out individual features, but something in her posture, in the way she held herself, seemed familiar. She didn't approach, but neither did she flee, just maintained that steady gaze that seemed to bridge the gap between their worlds. Silas stood equally still, afraid that any movement might break the spell. For several minutes they regarded each other across the forest clearing, two beings whose lives had intersected in ways that defied explanation. Then, as silently as she'd appeared, she melted back into the forest, leaving only the memory of connection. Walking home, Silas felt a completeness he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Whether or not the bobcat had been Maple, the encounter represented something profound, the knowledge that love, once given freely, never truly disappears but transforms into something larger than itself. Somewhere in the forest, life continued, its ancient dance, and he had played a small but crucial role in ensuring that dance went on. That night, he sat by his fireplace with a cup of tea, listening to the wind move through the trees surrounding his cabin. In its whispers, he heard echoes of tiny purrs, remembered the weight of a small body curled against his chest. It felt again the profound satisfaction of a life saved and a future secured. The emptiness he'd written about in his journal had been filled, not with presence, but with purpose. Not with possession, but with connection to something infinitely larger than himself. The smallest bobcat ever seen had indeed been too small to survive by conventional measures, but convention had never accounted for the power of dedication, in the strength of love, given without condition, or the mysterious ways in which life finds a way to continue against impossible odds. In saving Maple, Silas had saved something in himself, and in doing so, had contributed to the Great 10, ongoing story of survival and renewal that defines the wild world. Outside his window, the forest held its secrets close, but Silas no longer felt excluded from its mysteries. He had played his part in the ancient drama of life and death, had chosen hope over pragmatism, love over logic, and somewhere in the darkness beyond his lamplight, that choice echoed forward into a future filled with possibilities he would never see but had helped make possible. 2 years later, as autumn painted the forest in shades of gold and crimson, Silas received an unexpected visitor, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a wildlife biologist from the State University, knocked on his door with news that would fundamentally change how the scientific community viewed wildlife rehabilitation. Mr. Boone, I've been tracking bobcat populations in this region for my doctoral research, she explained, settling into the chair across from his fireplace with the enthusiasm of someone bursting with discovery. The genetic analysis we've conducted has revealed something extraordinary. Elena opened her laptop, showing Silas satellite tracking data and DNA results that meant little to him but clearly excited her tremendously. Maple, it turned out, had not only survived and reproduced, but had established the most successful territory documented in the region's recent history. Her hunting efficiency, territorial management, and maternal success rates exceeded those of wild-born bobcats by significant margins. What's remarkable is that her cubs show enhanced survival traits as well, Elena continued, her dark eyes bright with scientific fervor. It's as if the intensive care she received as an infant somehow programmed her with survival advantages that she's passing to her offspring. We're documenting behaviors we've never seen before, extended maternal care periods, sophisticated hunting instruction techniques, even apparent teaching of human avoidance strategies that suggest learned rather than instinctual responses. Silas listened with growing amazement as Elena described a phenomenon that challenged conventional understanding of wildlife development. Maple hadn't just survived her early trauma, she had transformed it into evolutionary advantage. The months of careful feeding, the patient socialization, the gradual introduction to hunting, all of it had created a more adaptable, more successful predator. We'd like to publish our findings, Elena said carefully, but we need your permission to include details about her early care. Your methods could revolutionize how we approach wildlife rehabilitation, particularly for rejected or orphaned predators. The prospect of scientific recognition felt surreal to Silas. He'd acted not from methodology, but from instinct, from the simple belief that every life deserved a chance. To learn that his nighttime feedings and improvised care had contributed to something larger than individual survival moved him in ways he struggled to articulate. If it helps other animals like Maple, then yes, he said finally. But I want people to understand this wasn't about proving anything. It was about giving one small creature the chance she deserved. 6 months later, the paper titled Enhanced Survival Strategies in Hand-Reared Bobcats, Evidence for Epigenetic Adaptation appeared in the Journal of Wildlife Management, with Silas listed as co-author. The scientific community took notice, and suddenly his quiet cabin became a destination for researchers, veterinarians, and wildlife rehabilitators seeking to understand his methods. More importantly, the research led to policy changes in wildlife rehabilitation centers across 3 states. The Maple Protocol, as it became known, established new guidelines for caring for rejected predator cubs, emphasizing patience, individual attention, and gradual wild transition rather than quick release or euthanasia. On a crisp October morning, exactly 3 years after Maple's release, Silas made his weekly walk through the forest with a new companion. Tessa had found him a great horned owl with neurological damage that would prevent his return to the wild but left him alert and social. Phoenix, as Silas had named him, rode on his shoulder, yellow eyes scanning the forest with predatory interest, despite his inability to hunt. As they reached the clearing where Maple had taken her first steps toward freedom, Phoenix suddenly became agitated, his head swiveling toward a particular section of forest. Silas followed his gaze and felt his breath catch in his throat. 3 bobcats sat in the dappled sunlight, a large female and 2 half-grown cubs. The female was unmistakably Maple, now in her prime, her coat thick and lustrous, her posture radiating confidence and strength. But it was her behavior that stunned Silas into silence. She had positioned herself where he could see her clearly, had brought her cubs to this specific place at this specific time. As he watched, she began what could only be described as a hunting demonstration, showing her offspring how to stalk, how to position themselves for optimal strikes, how to read the forest signs that indicated prey presence. The lesson continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Maple occasionally glancing toward Silas as if ensuring he was observing. Her cubs, now nearly adult-sized, followed her instructions with the focused attention of eager students. When the lesson concluded, all 3 cats looked directly at him, a moment of acknowledgement that transcended species boundaries. Then, with the same silent grace that had characterized her departure 3 years earlier, Maple led her cubs deeper into the forest. But this time, instead of vanishing completely, she paused at the edge of visibility, turned back once more, and in a gesture that would live in Silas's memory forever dipped her head in what could only be interpreted as a bow. Walking home with Phoenix shifting contentedly on his shoulder, Silas felt the completion of a circle that had begun with a midnight phone call and a dying cub. Maple had not only survived and thrived, she had become a teacher, passing on not just genetic material but learned wisdom to the next generation. In showing him her cubs, in demonstrating their education, she had offered him the greatest gift possible, proof that love, given freely and without expectation, ripples forward through time in ways that exceed imagination. That evening, Silas added a final entry to Maple's journal, Day 1. 095. Maple has taught her cubs to hunt, to survive, to thrive. In doing so, she taught me that some stories never truly end. They just transform into new chapters written by those who come after. The smallest bobcat ever seen was never too small to change the world. She just needed someone to believe she could. As darkness settled over the forest, Silas sat by his fireplace with Phoenix perched nearby, both of them listening to the night sounds that spoke of a wilderness where love had taken root and grown into something far larger than either had dared to imagine. Somewhere in those woods, Maple's cubs were learning to read the forest's ancient language, carrying forward not just the instincts of their species, but the enhanced wisdom born from a bond between human and wild that had defied every conventional expectation. The rescue had become a legacy. In the smallest bobcat, a symbol of what was possible when hope refused to surrender to probability. And in the quiet cabin where it all began, an old man and a damaged owl kept watch over a world where miracles, on Zabegan, never truly ended.